The desert wind that swept across the North African coast near the tiny Egyptian railway station called El Alamein in late October 1942 carried with it the dust of 2 years of brutal back-and-forth fighting between Axis and Allied forces competing for control of Egypt, the Suez Canal, and ultimately the oil fields of the Middle East that would determine which side could sustain mechanized warfare across multiple theaters. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of the German-Italian Panzer Army Afrika, stood at his headquarters studying maps that showed his forces were desperately short of fuel, ammunition, and supplies while facing a British Eighth Army that had been massively reinforced and that now possessed overwhelming numerical superiority in tanks, artillery, aircraft, and men. Rommel understood with absolute clarity that his situation was essentially hopeless, that the logistics situation made sustained offensive operations impossible, and the defensive operations could only delay rather than prevent eventual defeat. The supply ships that his forces depended on were being sunk by British aircraft and submarines, operating from Malta faster than replacements could arrive. The fuel shortages meant that tanks often sat immobile, not from battle damage, but from empty fuel tanks. Ammunition rationing forced artillery batteries to conserve shells even during critical defensive battles, when concentrated fire might have broken attacking British formations. Food supplies were so inadequate that German and Italian soldiers were on starvation rations that sapped their strength and their will to continue fighting. The British Eighth Army, by contrast, had received continuous reinforcements and supplies flowing through the Suez Canal and Egyptian ports, building up overwhelming material superiority that Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, who had assumed command of Eighth Army in August 1942, intended to exploit through methodical operations that would destroy Rommel's forces through systematic application of superior firepower rather than through the kind of mobile warfare that had characterized previous desert campaigns. Montgomery had spent 2 months since assuming command rebuilding Eighth Army's shattered morale after the defeats and retreats that had brought Rommel's forces to within 60 miles of Alexandria, training units in the tactics they would employ during the coming offensive, and accumulating the massive quantities of artillery ammunition that his battle plan required. The contrast between the two armies facing each other across the minefields and defensive positions near El Alamein in October 1942 was stark in every measurable dimension. The British Eighth Army fielded approximately 195,000 men, organized in 10 infantry divisions and 3 armored divisions with supporting artillery, engineers, and logistics units. The Axis forces totaled approximately 104,000 men, including 54,000 Germans and 50,000 Italians organized in 4 German divisions and 8 Italian divisions with significantly less artillery and logistics support than their British opponents possessed. Tank strength favored the British even more dramatically, with approximately 130 British tanks facing about 560 Axis tanks. And the British advantage was qualitative as well as quantitative, because approximately 250 of the British tanks were newly arrived American M4 Shermans with 75mm guns that could engage German tanks on relatively equal terms. Artillery numbers told an even more one-sided story, with the British deploying approximately 900 field and medium guns compared to about 550 Axis guns, and British ammunition stockpiles were essentially unlimited, while Axis forces operated under severe ammunition restrictions that prevented them from matching British fire support. Air superiority was completely one-sided, with the Royal Air Force's Desert Air Force flying approximately 750 operational aircraft against perhaps 350 Axis aircraft, and British air superiority meant that Axis forces moved primarily at night to avoid devastating air attacks, while British forces could operate freely during daylight with constant air cover and close air support. The defensive position that Axis forces had constructed near El Alamein exploited the geographical features that made this particular area favorable for defense. The Mediterranean Sea formed the northern anchor of the defensive line approximately 40 miles inland from Alexandria. 30 miles south of the coast, the Qattara Depression created an impassable obstacle, a vast area of salt marshes and quicksand that no military force could cross with heavy equipment. Between the sea and the depression, Axis forces had constructed extensive minefields, defensive positions, and strong points, creating a fortified line that could not be outflanked and that would have to be breached through direct assault if British forces wanted to advance westward toward Libya. The defensive preparations included literally hundreds of thousands of mines laid in belts, sometimes miles deep, creating obstacles that attacking forces would have to clear under fire before armor could advance. Behind the minefields, infantry occupied defensive positions protected by trenches, sandbags, and whatever overhead cover could be improvised from available materials. Artillery was positioned to provide defensive fire on the minefields and on likely British assembly areas. Anti-tank guns were sighted to engage British armor attempting to exploit any breakthrough. The entire defensive system was designed to channel British attacks into kill zones where concentrated fire could destroy attacking forces before they could achieve breakthrough. Montgomery's plan for breaking through these defenses, designated Operation Lightfoot, reflected his methodical approach and his determination to use overwhelming firepower to minimize British casualties while systematically destroying Axis defensive capabilities. Operation would begin with a massive artillery bombardment, the heaviest concentration of artillery fire in the North African campaign, that would suppress Axis defensive positions while British engineers cleared lanes through the minefields. Infantry would advance through the cleared lanes to seize objectives in the enemy defensive zone. Once infantry had secured positions in the enemy rear areas, armor would pass through and exploit the breakthrough, engaging and destroying Axis armor in mobile combat where British numerical superiority would be decisive. The artillery preparation that began at 2140 hours on October 23, 1942, announced the offensive's beginning with a roar that could be heard dozens of miles away. Nearly 900 British guns fired simultaneously, delivering concentrated fire on Axis positions identified through air reconnaissance, intelligence reports, and ground observation during the weeks leading up to the attack. The bombardment focused initially on Axis artillery positions, attempting to neutralize the guns that could disrupt British infantry advances, then shifted to defensive positions where Axis infantry waited in trenches and dugouts. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous thunder that merged individual gun reports into a sustained roar, punctuated by the impacts of hundreds of shells exploding in the Axis defensive zone. The infantry advance that followed the initial bombardment saw British and Commonwealth troops moving forward through the darkness toward objectives marked by artillery fire and illuminated by searchlights bounced off clouds to provide artificial moonlight. The advancing infantry encountered minefields even denser than expected, and Axis defensive fire that was better coordinated than intelligence had predicted, despite the artillery bombardment's destructive effects. Progress was slower than planned as engineers worked frantically to clear mine lanes under fire, while infantry fought to suppress Axis defensive positions that were supposed to have been neutralized by the bombardment, but that continued resisting fiercely. The 51st Highland Division attacking in the northern sector, achieved some of the deepest penetrations during the first night, advancing several thousand yards into Axis positions and establishing themselves on objectives that would serve as launching points for subsequent operations. The 9th Australian Division, fighting along the coastal area, made more limited progress against determined German defenders from the 164th Light Division, who fought with the kind of desperate determination that characterized Wehrmacht defensive operations throughout the war. The New Zealand Division in the center encountered extensive minefields and heavy fire that slowed their advance and prevented them from reaching all their assigned objectives by dawn. The South African and Indian divisions attacking in the southern sector faced even greater difficulties with minefields and prepared defenses that proved more formidable than expected. The diversionary attacks in this area were supposed to draw Axis reserves away from the main effort in the north, but the strength of Axis defenses and the difficulties clearing minefields prevented South African and Indian forces from making the kind of progress that would force Rommel to commit reserves to counterattacks that appeared to threaten breakthrough. The failure of the southern attacks to achieve their diversionary purpose meant that Axis reserves remained available to counter the main British effort in the north. By dawn on October 24th, after a night of intense fighting, British forces had achieved partial success that fell short of Montgomery's ambitious objectives. Infantry had penetrated into Axis positions in several areas and had cleared some lanes through the minefields, but they had not broken through to the open desert beyond the defensive zone where armor could maneuver freely. The armor that was supposed to pass through during the night and emerge into the enemy rear areas by dawn remained stuck in traffic jams in the minefield lanes, unable to advance because infantry fighting ahead blocked the narrow cleared passages, and because Axis anti-tank fire covered the exits from the minefields, making it suicidal for tanks to emerge into the open. The tank commanders stuck in the minefields during that first night experienced a special kind of frustration and fear as they sat immobile in narrow lanes marked by white tape, unable to maneuver, exposed to German artillery fire that was searching for the cleared lanes, and completely dependent on the infantry, fighting ahead to open routes for armor to advance. Tanks were destroyed by mines when commanders tried to maneuver around vehicles blocking the lanes. Others were hit by artillery fire that bracketed the minefield lanes once German observers identified where British armor was concentrated. The entire carefully planned operation seemed to be stalling despite the overwhelming British advantages in numbers and firepower. Montgomery reacted to the first day's disappointing results with characteristic determination to continue grinding forward regardless of casualties or setbacks, trusting that systematic pressure applied continuously would eventually break Axis defenses, even if initial breakthrough attempts failed to achieve their objectives. He ordered renewed attacks during the nights of October 24th and 25th, accepting heavy casualties as the price of maintaining pressure on Axis forces that were also suffering severely from British artillery fire and from the constant attrition of defensive combat. The fighting developed into brutal attritional warfare where small unit actions determined outcomes, where courage and determination mattered, but where superior numbers and firepower ultimately prevailed through sheer cumulative effect. Rommel was in Germany on sick leave when the British offensive began, having been ordered home by his doctors who were concerned that his declining health from months of combat stress, inadequate food, and desert conditions was threatening his ability to continue commanding effectively. General Georg Stumme temporarily commanded Panzer Army Afrika in Rommel's absence, and Stumme responded to the British attack by committing reserves, including armored units, to counter the penetrations that British infantry had achieved. On the morning of October 24th, Stumme drove forward to observe the fighting personally and assess the situation, a common practice for German commanders who believed in leading from the front and seeing conditions firsthand, rather than relying entirely on reports from subordinates. Stumme's vehicle came under British artillery fire during his reconnaissance, and the general suffered a fatal heart attack, either from the stress of being under fire or from the exertion of attempting to escape the vehicle after it was hit. His death created a command crisis at a critical moment when Axis forces needed decisive leadership to coordinate defenses against continued British attacks. Command temporarily fell to General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, the Afrika Corps commander, but Hitler immediately ordered Rommel to return to Africa and resume command, despite his health problems and despite the fact that the situation was already deteriorating beyond recovery. Rommel flew back to Africa on October 25th and immediately assessed that the situation was dire but not yet hopeless if Axis forces could contain British penetrations and prevent the breakthrough that would expose Axis rear areas to British armor. He ordered counterattacks attempting to eliminate the British salient that had been driven into Axis lines, committing his limited armor reserves, including the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions, to attacks designed to drive British forces back and restore the integrity of the defensive line. These counterattacks achieved local successes, destroying some British tanks and forcing some withdrawals, but they consumed fuel and ammunition that could never be replaced, and they suffered tank losses from British anti-tank guns and artillery that steadily reduced Axis armored strength. The fighting from October 25th through October 28th developed into a grinding battle of attrition characterized by continuous British attacks against Axis positions, Axis counterattacks attempting to restore their defensive line, massive artillery bombardments by both sides, and constant air attacks on Axis positions by British aircraft that faced minimal opposition from German and Italian fighters that lacked fuel for sustained operations. British casualties mounted steadily as infantry repeatedly attacked defensive positions that German and Italian troops defended with desperate determination. Tank losses on both sides were heavy from the combination of mines, anti-tank guns, and tank versus tank combat in confined spaces where maneuver was impossible. Montgomery's willingness to accept casualties while maintaining offensive pressure reflected his understanding that British advantages in numbers and logistics meant that losses could be replaced while Axis losses could not. Every British tank destroyed could be replaced from reserves that included hundreds of additional tanks held back from the initial attacks. Every round of artillery ammunition expended could be replaced from stockpiles containing millions of shells. Every casualty could be replaced by reinforcements arriving continuously through Egyptian ports. Rommel faced the opposite situation where every loss was irreplaceable, where ammunition expenditure was limited by the small quantities available, and where casualties depleted units that would receive no replacements. The Australian 9th Division's attacks along the coastal area beginning on October 28th created a crisis for Axis defenses when Australian infantry drove deep into German positions in fighting that the Germans would call the toughest battle we have ever fought. The Australians attacked at night after careful reconnaissance and planning, penetrating German positions and establishing themselves in areas where they could threaten the coastal road that was Axis forces' main supply route. Rommel was forced to commit his last reserves, including elements of both panzer divisions, to contain the Australian penetration, weakening other sectors of his defensive line and setting conditions for the decisive British breakthrough that would come in early November. By November 1st, Axis armored strength had been reduced to approximately 90 operational tanks through combat losses, mechanical breakdowns, and fuel shortages that left some tanks immobilized despite being undamaged. British armor strength remained over 600 tanks, despite losses suffered during 2 weeks of continuous combat. The disparity was so overwhelming that any British breakthrough would lead to rapid exploitation that Axis forces would be unable to counter. Rommel understood this clearly and requested permission from Hitler to begin withdrawing his forces westward toward Libya before they were completely encircled and destroyed. Hitler's response was the famous Stand Fast order, directing Rommel to hold his positions without any withdrawal and to accept complete destruction rather than give up any ground. Montgomery launched Operation Supercharge on November 2nd. A renewed offensive focused on a narrow front in the northern sector where concentrated British forces, including the 2nd New Zealand Division, reinforced with additional armor, would punch through the weakened Axis defenses and break into open desert where British armor could maneuver freely. The attack began with another massive artillery bombardment that concentrated fire from hundreds of guns on a narrow front, attempting to overwhelm Axis defenses through sheer firepower before infantry advanced. The New Zealand infantry, supported by British armor, attacked during the immobile night of November 2nd-3rd, pushing through Axis defensive positions and clearing lanes for armor, despite suffering heavy casualties from German defensive fire. The breakthrough that Montgomery had sought for 10 days was finally achieved on November 3rd when British armor penetrated beyond Axis defensive positions into relatively open desert west of the defensive line. Rommel's mobile reserves, reduced to a handful of tanks, attempted to seal the breach, but were simply overwhelmed by British numerical superiority. Axis defensive positions that had held for days despite continuous attacks began collapsing as British forces exploited the breakthrough, advancing into Axis rear areas and threatening to encircle large portions of Axis infantry divisions that lacked the mobility to withdraw before being surrounded. Rommel made the agonizing decision to disregard Hitler's Stand Fast order and begin withdrawing his mobile forces westward on November 3rd, understanding that following Hitler's directive would result in the complete destruction of Panzer Army Afrika within days. Italian infantry divisions that lacked transport were sacrificed, left behind to delay British pursuit, while German mobile units and the few Italian units with adequate transport began withdrawing westward along the coastal road toward Libya. The withdrawal was conducted under British air attack and harassment by British armored units attempting to cut off the retreat, but Rommel's skill at conducting fighting withdrawals and the exhaustion of British units after 2 weeks of intense combat allowed most German forces to escape encirclement. The Second Battle of El Alamein officially ended on November 4th, when British forces broke through remaining Axis defensive positions and began pursuing the retreating Axis forces westward. Rommel's Panzer Army Afrika had been decisively defeated, suffering approximately 30,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured, losing approximately 500 tanks and most of its artillery, and being forced into a retreat that would continue for hundreds of miles until Axis forces eventually established new defensive positions in Tunisia. British and Commonwealth casualties totaled approximately 13,500 killed and wounded, heavy losses that reflected the intensity of the fighting but sustainable given British numerical superiority and the strategic importance of the victory. The strategic significance of the El Alamein victory was enormous for both military and psychological reasons. Militarily, The victory ended the threat to Egypt and the Suez Canal that had existed since 1940, securing British control of the Middle East and ensuring that oil supplies from Iraq and Iran would continue flowing to Allied forces. The defeat forced Axis forces into a long retreat across Libya toward Tunisia, abandoning all the territory that Rommel had conquered during his previous offensives and eliminating Axis presence from Egypt permanently. The victory provided a the launching point for future Allied operations in North Africa that would culminate in the complete destruction of Axis forces in Tunisia in May 1943. Psychologically, El Alamein provided the first clear British land victory over German forces and shattered the myth of German invincibility that had grown through 3 years of German victories in Poland, France, the Balkans, and the early campaigns in North Africa and Russia. Churchill would later write that, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat," an overstatement that nevertheless captured the battle's importance as a turning point in British fortunes and in public morale. The victory demonstrated that properly equipped and well-led British forces could defeat the Wehrmacht in sustained combat, providing confidence that would carry through subsequent campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and eventually Northwest Europe. The battle also validated Montgomery's methodical approach to operations, his insistence on achieving overwhelming material superiority before attacking, his willingness to accept heavy casualties while maintaining offensive pressure, and his focus on destroying enemy forces through attrition rather than achieving breakthrough through maneuver. These principles would characterize Montgomery's command style throughout the remainder of the war, generating both admiration for his consistent success in achieving objectives and criticism from those who believed more aggressive and imaginative approaches could have achieved better results with fewer casualties. Rommel's performance during the battle demonstrated both his tactical skill and the fundamental impossibility of his strategic situation. His defensive preparations and his leadership during the fighting extracted maximum effectiveness from forces that were outnumbered, outgunned, and desperately short of supplies. His decision to disregard Hitler's stand-fast order and conduct a fighting withdrawal saved most of his German forces from destruction and allowed them to continue fighting during the subsequent retreat to Tunisia. But no amount of tactical skill could overcome the logistics crisis that left Axis forces starving, short of ammunition, and unable to replace losses while facing an enemy with essentially unlimited supplies and reinforcements. The logistics situation that doomed Axis forces in North Africa reflected broader strategic problems that would eventually ensure Allied victory in World War II. Germany and Italy simply could not match Allied industrial production and could not sustain forces operating at the end of extended supply lines that were vulnerable to interdiction by enemy air and naval forces. The Mediterranean supply routes that Axis forces in North Africa depended on were under constant attack from British submarines, aircraft operating from Malta, and surface forces, resulting in loss rates that made sustaining adequate supply levels impossible even when convoys got through. The British, by contrast, benefited from secure supply lines through the Suez Canal and around the Cape of Good Hope that allowed massive quantities of equipment and supplies to flow to Egypt, despite German U-boat operations in the Atlantic. American supplies, including Sherman tanks, trucks, artillery, and aircraft, arrived in increasing quantities as American industrial production reached full wartime output. The material balance favored Britain so overwhelmingly by late 1942 that defeat of Axis forces in North Africa had become inevitable once British commanders developed the skill and determination to translate material superiority into battlefield victories. The tank warfare that characterized El Alamein and previous North African battles provided lessons that influenced armored doctrine development throughout the war and afterward. The fighting demonstrated the importance of combined arms operations, integrating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support rather than employing tanks as an independent arm operating separately from other forces. British early war tank doctrine that emphasized independent armored operations without adequate infantry or artillery support had resulted in catastrophic losses during 1941 and early 1942, when German forces using combined arms tactics destroyed British armor that attacked without proper support. By El Alamein, British forces had learned to coordinate armor with infantry and artillery, using infantry to clear anti-tank positions before committing armor to exploitation and using artillery to suppress enemy defenses and to break up enemy counterattacks. The improved combined arms tactics contributed significantly to British success at El Alamein and would continue to be refined during subsequent campaigns. The Germans had practiced effective combined arms operations from the beginning of the war, but their skill could not overcome the numerical and material disadvantages they faced at El Alamein and in subsequent North African battles. The arrival of American Sherman tanks in substantial numbers for El Alamein provided British forces with armor that could engage German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks on relatively equal terms for the first time in the North African campaign. Previous British tanks, including Crusaders and Valentines, had been inferior to German armor in firepower, armor protection, or reliability, forcing British forces to rely on numerical superiority and tactical skill to compensate for qualitative disadvantages. The Sherman 75mm gun could penetrate German tank armor at reasonable combat ranges. Its armor provided adequate protection against German tank guns and anti-tank weapons, and its mechanical reliability was superior to earlier British tanks that frequently broke down during operations. The German Tiger tank made its combat debut during the final stages of the El Alamein battle, with a small number of Tigers being committed to action during the fighting in early November. The Tigers proved nearly invulnerable to British tank guns and anti-tank weapons, able to destroy British tanks at ranges where return fire was ineffective. But the small numbers available, mechanical problems that plagued the new design, and the general collapse of Axis defenses meant that Tigers could not significantly affect the battle's outcome despite their impressive combat performance in individual engagements. The Tiger's appearance foreshadowed the qualitative superiority that German armor would increasingly possess during the later war years, even as German numerical inferiority in tanks and all other equipment categories became increasingly overwhelming. The air campaign that accompanied the ground fighting at El Alamein demonstrated the decisive importance of air superiority in modern warfare. The RAF's Desert Air Force flew thousands of sorties during the battle, attacking Axis defensive positions, interdicting supply lines, engaging German and Italian aircraft, and providing close air support for British ground forces. The constant air attacks forced Axis forces to move primarily at night, restricted their ability to concentrate forces or supplies, and imposed psychological stress on troops who could never know when the next attack would come. German and Italian air forces, outnumbered and hampered by fuel shortages, could not contest British air superiority or provide adequate support for their own ground forces. The intelligence battle that preceded and accompanied El Alamein also contributed to British success. British intelligence services had extensively penetrated Axis communication security, reading German and Italian encrypted messages through ultra-decrypts and through other intelligence sources. Montgomery received detailed information about Axis force dispositions, supply situations, and operational intentions, allowing him to plan his offensive with precise knowledge of what he would face and how Axis forces would likely respond. Rommel operated with much less complete intelligence about British forces, relying primarily on tactical reconnaissance that could not provide the strategic picture that Ultra gave British commanders. The deception operations that British forces conducted before Alamein helped achieve surprise regarding the timing and location of the main attack, despite the obvious buildup of British forces and supplies that German reconnaissance could observe. British forces constructed dummy tanks and vehicles in the southern sector while concealing actual concentrations in the north, leading Axis intelligence to expect the main attack in the south rather than where it actually came. The deception was not perfect and did not prevent Axis forces from fighting effectively once the battle began, but it contributed to initial confusion about British intentions and complicated Axis defensive planning. The personal rivalry and contrast between Montgomery and Rommel became one of the most famous military command relationships of World War II, with both commanders developing reputations that would outlive them and that would generate extensive historical debate about their relative merits as military leaders. Rommel was celebrated as a daring and innovative commander who achieved remarkable successes despite material disadvantages, a master of mobile warfare who understood how to exploit enemy mistakes and how to seize fleeting opportunities. His personal courage and his habit of leading from the front earned him respect from both his own troops and from enemy soldiers who admired his skill even while fighting against him. Montgomery was methodical where Rommel was daring, careful where Rommel was bold, focused on systematic preparation and overwhelming material superiority rather than attempting to achieve success through brilliant maneuver with inadequate forces. His careful approach frustrated subordinates who wanted more aggressive action and who believed faster results were possible through bolder operations. But Montgomery's methods achieved consistent success without the dramatic reversals that characterized Rommel's career, and his victories from El Alamein onward demonstrated that systematic application of superior resources could achieve decisive results, even if the approach seemed unimaginative to critics who valued operational artistry over methodical effectiveness. The political significance of El Alamein extended beyond its military implications to affect British politics and Churchill's position as Prime Minister. Churchill had faced growing criticism during 1942 about British military performance and about his leadership as defeats mounted in North Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Atlantic. The El Alamein victory silenced critics and validated Churchill's strategic direction, strengthening his political position and ensuring that he could continue leading Britain's war effort without serious challenge to his authority. The victory also improved relations with the United States by demonstrating that British forces could achieve decisive success against German forces, countering American doubts about British military effectiveness. The coordination between the El Alamein offensive and Operation Torch, the Anglo-American invasion of French North Africa that began on November 8th, just days after El Alamein's conclusion, created a strategic pincer that trapped Axis forces in North Africa between advancing British Eighth Army from the east and Allied forces advancing from the west after landing in Morocco and Algeria. The timing was deliberate, with Allied planners intending that Rommel's forces would be heavily engaged at El Alamein when Torch began, preventing him from concentrating against either Allied force. The strategic coordination worked perfectly, forcing Rommel into a two-front situation that made eventual Axis defeat in North Africa inevitable. The German and Italian decision to heavily reinforce Tunisia after Operation Torch began reflected Hitler's determination not to abandon North Africa, despite the increasingly hopeless strategic situation. German forces that could have been deployed to other theaters where they might have affected outcomes were instead sent to Tunisia, where they would ultimately be destroyed or captured when Axis resistance collapsed in May 1943. The decision to reinforce failure in Tunisia was strategically irrational, but reflected Hitler's unwillingness to accept any territorial losses and his tendency to make military decisions based on political considerations rather than military logic. The veterans who fought at El Alamein on both sides carried memories of the battle throughout their lives, remembering specific moments of terror and courage, specific losses of friends and comrades, specific actions that seemed important at the time and that retained significance decades later when survivors gathered at reunions or wrote memoirs, attempting to capture their experiences for those who had not been there. British veterans remembered the overwhelming artillery bombardment that began the battle, the tense night advances through minefields under fire, the satisfaction of finally breaking through after days of grinding combat. German and Italian veterans remembered desperate defensive fighting against overwhelming odds, the constant fear of British air attacks, the knowledge that they were fighting without hope of victory. The battlefield itself, located along a narrow coastal strip in the western desert between the Mediterranean and the Qattara Depression, remains largely unchanged from its wartime appearance, despite decades passing since the fighting ended. The desert has preserved the scars of battle, including shell craters, trenches, and defensive positions that are still visible. The extensive minefields laid by both sides during the battle remained dangerous for decades afterward, killing and injuring civilians and requiring extensive clearance operations that continued into the 21st century. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission maintains extensive cemeteries near El Alamein, where thousands of British, Commonwealth, and German soldiers who died during the battle are buried. The annual commemorations held at El Alamein bring together veterans, historians, and officials from the nations that fought there, ceremonies that honor the sacrifice of those who died while acknowledging the historical significance of the battle in determining the war's outcome. The commemorations have evolved over decades from gatherings focused primarily on mourning losses to events that emphasize reconciliation between former enemies and that recognize the shared humanity of soldiers who fought on opposite sides. German and British veterans who met at commemoration events often discovered mutual respect and even friendship based on shared experiences of combat, despite having tried to kill each other during the battle. The historiography of El Alamein has evolved since 1942 as historians gained access to additional documents, as participants published memoirs and accounts, and as changing interpretations reflected different perspectives on what the battle achieved and what it cost. Early accounts emphasized the dramatic nature of Montgomery's victory and the transformation it represented in British military fortunes. Later, scholarship examined the battle more critically, questioning whether Montgomery's methodical approach achieved results as efficiently as possible, whether casualties could have been reduced through different tactics, and whether the strategic significance was as decisive as Churchill's famous quote suggested. The debate about Montgomery's generalship at El Alamein continues among military historians, with no consensus reached about whether his performance represented military brilliance or merely competent execution of a battle that overwhelming material superiority made almost impossible to lose. Critics argue that a more imaginative commander could have achieved breakthrough faster and with fewer casualties through bolder maneuver. Defenders respond that Montgomery's careful approach ensured victory without risking defeat through overreach, and that accepting higher casualties to achieve faster results would not have changed the strategic situation significantly. Both interpretations have merit and reflect different philosophies about what constitutes effective military leadership. Rommel's performance has been generally admired by historians who recognize that he faced an impossible situation and that his tactical skill extended Axis resistance in North Africa for months longer than should have been possible given the material balance. But some scholarship has questioned whether Rommel's aggressive operations during 1941 and 1942 that extended Axis supply lines deep into Egypt without adequate logistics support were strategically wise, or whether a more defensive posture closer to Axis bases in Libya might have been more sustainable. The question remains whether Rommel's daring created opportunities that might have led to decisive success with better logistics support, or whether his offensives were strategically misguided attempts to achieve operationally what the strategic situation made impossible. The Second Battle of El Alamein stands as one of the pivotal battles of World War II, the point where Allied forces in one major theater definitively seized the initiative from Axis forces and began the sustained offensive operations that would eventually lead to complete Allied victory. The battle demonstrated that properly equipped and well-led Allied forces could defeat German forces in sustained combat. That material superiority could be translated into battlefield success through methodical operations, and that the Axis powers could not sustain forces operating at the ends of vulnerable supply lines against enemies with secure logistics and industrial capacity. That dwarfed Axis production. These lessons learned in the Western Desert would apply equally to subsequent campaigns in Italy, France, and Germany, as Allied material advantages grew even larger, and as German strategic situation continued its inexorable deterioration toward total defeat.